So there's a little story about Brian that I would like to share with everyone. I met Brian a long time ago when he was chairing the Australia-India Business Week. And at the same time, he was chairing Australia-India Youth Dialogue as well. And that's where Sonal met him. And then few years later is when I learned about Protsahan and Sonal, and then I came to volunteer here. And I haven't left. I'm probably the longest serving volunteer, but yeah. So I think Brian has a big role to play in making sure both of us are working on Protsahan today. Right, Brian? So yeah, and he's a Mumbaikar at heart. Not many people know about him. He was born here in Mumbai, and he lives in Adelaide now, but his heart belongs here. So, yeah, please join me in welcoming Brian Hayes. And Brian, a few words from you.
Thank you, Jazz. I feel a little out of it here because I only speak English. I don't speak any other language. I can understand a little bit of Hindi, but only for the purposes of telling the taxi drivers where to go. So bear with me. The other thing I want to just say is I've got a limited time, quarter of an hour, and that's always a challenge for a barrister. But I'll endeavour to stick with that as much best I can. I've been asked to deal with the international, I suppose the international scene on child protection. I have to say that I don't know anything about that. But like a reasonably good barrister, I've tried to get across my brief and did some work to see whether I could make myself familiar. But I do say that I've looked at your list of speakers, and you are far more informed about this scene than I am. So once again, I'm going to ask you to bear with me with that disclaimer. Internationally, of course, the child protection area is governed by the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. Now, I say that because a lot of countries have signed that convention, and the convention is a comprehensive set of standards, as far as I can understand, about what I can only term are motherhood statements about the protection of the child. It talks about non-discrimination, best interests of the child, right to survival and development, and respect for the views of the child. Now, no one can argue with those. They are common across the board. But what it doesn't do is to address the issue of enforcement of those rules. So we have a good set of comprehensive rules, but I fear that we don't always have a good set of enforcement for those rules. I've been asked to look at some of the other countries worldwide who deal with these and who have attempted to address these issues. You know more about the situation in India than I would know, but my research has shown that there are a number of countries which have endeavoured to reflect the cornerstone of the United Nations Treaty within their own legislation. For example, countries like Sweden and Finland have recognized the treaty into their national legal systems. And that means they've ensured that those rights will be enforceable in the domestic courts. Sweden's ban on corporal punishment, for instance, not only protects children from physical harm, but also reinforces their respect for dignity and respect. the child welfare services emphasize prevention and early intervention. So you see, here's an example of where the United Nations Treaty has been embedded into their domestic laws, and therefore gives it a little bit more force, provided they are enforced. In New Zealand, there's the New Zealand Family Group service conferences, and these involve the extended family and community in decision-making processes regarding child's rights. This practice respects the culture of the kids as well, but it also includes the family in the attempt to protect the children's rights. How successful it is, I don't know, but that's what the law says. And very often, these statements depend very much on persons like yourselves who are at the front line of enforcement and protection of children's rights. In South Africa, the child justice system provides a reasonably powerful example of restorative justice. Now that means it prioritizes rehabilitation over punishment. In Australia, in my state, in South Australia, we also have restorative justice. And that provides an example of where the child may not be punished, where I'm talking now about juvenile crime rather than offences against the children, but where the child will not be punished, but rather given another chance. I can give you an example, a personal example of where that happened with me. We were away overseas and we had a house sitter in our house. The house sitter was woken up one night with a banging on the front door, and indeed the door was then bashed open with this very young student, I suppose, very young but very drunk student who was coming home from a party. And he thought he had his house and he couldn't get in, but in fact it was my house, and he banged down the front door. Can you imagine the concern and the fright of the house sitter to see this young man trying to get into the house? And so she called the police. The police came along. The young man was arrested. He was only a juvenile. He was at a very well-known and well-respected college. And when we got back, I went to the police station. I said, look, what's happened here? And they said, well, this kid tried to break into your house. He was drunk. He was after a party. He thought it was his house, and he just made a mistake. So the lawyer who was representing him said to me, well, look, would you be prepared to come and meet with him and the family and see whether we can resolve this without the need to press charges? So I met with his family, his father and the young boy, who was very, very distressed as a result of what he'd done. And his father said, look, I'll recompense you for the door and everything else that's happened. I can't do anything about the fright that this young lad caused the young babysitter in our house, or house sitter rather. And I said, well, look, I'm fine with that, provided he knows what he's done, and provided I can be satisfied that he will not do it again. And so we had a discussion with the son, and the son was distraught. He'd lost it. But I could see that if he went to court, he'd have a criminal conviction against him. He was a young student, and that would stay with him for the rest of his life. So we decided, no, we'll withdraw the charges. He apologized, and I said, I hope I don't see you again, which I didn't. But that's the sort of restorative justice system that we have in South Australia. And it works the other way as well with offences against children as well as offences by children. Estonia, I find, leads the way in guaranteeing digital access and education. Recognizing the importance of technology and development, Estonia ensures that children in even the most remote areas benefit from e-learning platforms. Now that's particularly interesting because you will no doubt have heard about Australia introducing restrictions on social media for children under 16. And I gather it's received a lot of press around the world. And that's very nice politically for the government of Australia. The legislation was rushed through Parliament with no or very little consultation or consideration. And you might not know, but we've got an election coming up early next year. So coincidentally, the government, this was bipartisan, it was supported by both parties, passed this legislation. But how is this legislation going to work? We don't know. There is no indications, there are no regulations, there's no information about how it will work, how it will be enforced. My granddaughter, one of my granddaughters is 13 and she's on social media. And I said to my daughter and to my granddaughter, I said, you realize now, Millie, you'll have to get off Snapchat. You can't go on Instagram. And she said, well, no one else is getting off it. I said, well, that's the law now. You've got to get off it. And I said to my daughter, you better enforce that now if she can't. And she said, Dad, look, if I enforce it against her and none of the other parents, because there's no enforcement provisions, there's nothing about it, the other parents say no, they'll stay as they are, she's going to be deprived. And it will in fact begin to act as a detriment to her. She won't know what all her friends are saying about her. And at that age, that's the most blatant form of bullying you can get online. So we have this major or so-called major piece of legislation which has just been introduced in Australia with no guidelines whatsoever. So I can't help you. I can't tell you how it'll work. You guys will have to work it out for yourselves. But the interesting part about child protection, in my view, is you can have as many laws as you like about it. The effective way of addressing child protection, child abuse, and bullying and harassment and all the rest of it, and particularly in socio-economic circumstances which are not equal around a place, the most effective way is what all of you are doing now on the ground. You understand it. You are seeing it firsthand. And you are assisting in making society better, despite the laws, but not because of the laws, because you're doing it out of passion and you're doing it because it's the right thing to do. I always think that the Parliament passes many laws without thinking it through when they do so. And I regret to say that a lot of it is very political in the way in which they initiate laws these days. Certainly in Australia. I mean, we have a four-year cycle, and there's no vision from the politicians beyond that 4-year term, because midway through the 4-year term, they're now getting ready for the next election, and that means ad hoc provisions with little consultation. So you'll see that I'm a bit of a cynic when it comes to politicians and the political system. But I'm not a cynic when it comes to Protsahan and NGOs like Protsahan. Now, I started my talk, I told you, I've given you examples of Estonia, Sweden, New Zealand, and so on, and of course Australia in terms of enforcement. And I want to tell you a little fairy tale. It's a fairy tale, like most fairy tales, it begins with the story of a young woman, 20-something years, on a trajectory which would make her right up at the top of her chosen profession. She was middle class, well educated, articulate, and she lived in India. And this young woman was well on her way to being a leader in her chosen profession. So much so that she was chosen by, after a good deal of many applications, she was chosen to represent India as one of the young leaders, future leaders in the country. As a result of being chosen to do that, she was able to engage in some significant dialogue, international dialogue between India and other countries, in particular Australia, for potential leaders of their various industries and professions. And this young woman, as I say, 20-something, was in the course of carrying out her task, and she found herself in a situation where she had an epiphany which caused a significant change in her life. That incident was a woman, a young Indian woman, pregnant woman with 4 girls who she got into conversation with while she was doing her job. And she naturally inquired about the woman who was pregnant, and that woman said that if she had another girl, she would drown the girl because she couldn't afford to have another girl in her slum family. That was the change in this young woman's life, who immediately resigned her job and went and set up a hole-in-the-wall centre for young abused girls in the slum. And that young woman had no skills other than art and craft and design. And she used those skills of art and craft and design to educate these abused young girls in the slum, in this hole-in-the-wall centre. So much so that she could bring them up, and she did this on her own, so much so that she could bring them up to a level where they could be educated enough to go to school. And that fairy tale, like all good fairy tales, this girl met her white knight. And her white knight in shining armour came along and gave up his job to join her in her enterprise. And that enterprise 10 or 12 years later has grown to such an extent that you are all here today to experience and work within it. And I don't need to tell you who that young woman is, because she's going to be the next speaker on this platform. Thank you very much.